We're back. Monday, September 28th, 1942. Dear Kitty, I had to stop yesterday long before I finished. I just must tell you about another quarrel. But before I start on that, something else. Why do grown-ups quarrel so easily? So much and over the most idiotic things. Up until now, I thought only children squabbled and that wore off as you grew up. Of course, there is sometimes a real reason for a quarrel, but this is just plain bickering. I suppose I should get used to it, but I can't, nor do I think I shall, as long as I am the subject of nearly every discussion. They use the word discussion instead of quarrel. Nothing, I repeat, nothing about me is right. My general appearance, my character, my manners are discussed from A to Z. I'm expected by order to simply swallow all the harsh words and shouts in the silence. I am not used to this. In fact, I can't. I'm not going to take all these insults lying down. I'll show them that Anne Frank wasn't born yesterday. Then they'll be surprised and perhaps they'll keep their mouths shut when I let them see I am going to start educating them. Shall I take up that attitude? Plain barbarism. I'm simply amazed again and again over the awful manners and especially stupidity Miss Van Dan's. But as soon as I get used to this, and it won't be long, then I'll give them some of their own back and no half measures. Then they'll change their tune. Am I really so bad-mannered, conceited, headstrong, pushing, stupid, lazy, etc., as they all say? Oh, of course not. I have my faults just like everyone else. I know that. But they thoroughly exaggerate everything. Kitty, if only you knew how sometimes I boil under so many jabs and jeers. And I don't know how long I shall be able to stifle my rage. I shall just blow up one day. Still, no more of this. I've bored you long enough with all these quarrels. But I simply must tell you one highly interesting discussion at the table. Somehow or other, we got on the subject of Pim, Daddy's nickname. Extreme modesty. Even the most stupid people have to admit this about Daddy. Even Mrs. Van Dan said, I too have an unassuming nature, more so than my husband. Did you ever? This sentence in itself shows quite clearly how thoroughly forward and pushing she is. Mr. Van Dan thought he ought to give an explanation regarding the reference to himself. I don't wish to be modest. In my experience, it does not pay. Then to me, take my advice, Anne. Don't be too unassuming. It doesn't get you anywhere. Mummy agreed with this too, but Mrs. Van Dan had to add, as always, her ideas on the subject. Her next remark was addressing to Mummy and Daddy. You have a strange outlook on life. Fancy saying such things to Anne. It was very different when I was young, and I feel sure that it still is, except your modern home. This was direct hit at the way Mummy brings up her daughters. Mrs. Van Dan was scarlet by this time. Mummy, calm and cool as a cucumber. People who blush get so hot and excited, it's quite a handicap in such a situation. Mummy, still entirely unruffled, but anxious to close the conversation as soon as possible. Thought for a second, and then said, I find too, Miss Van Dan, that one gets on better in life if one is not over-modest. My husband now and Margot and Peter are exceptionally modest, whereas your husband and you and I, though not exactly the opposite, don't allow ourselves to be completely pushed to one side. Miss Van Dan. But, Miss Frank, I don't understand you. I'm so very modest and retiring. How can you think of calling me anything else? Mummy. I did not say you were exactly forward, but no one could say you had a retiring disposition. Miss Van Dam. Let us get this matter cleared up once and for all. I'd like to know in what way I am pushing. I know one thing. If I didn't look after myself, I'd soon be starving. This absurd remark in self-defense just made Mummy rock with laughter. That irritated Miss Van Dam, who added a string of German, Dutch, German expressions until she became completely tongue-tied. And then she rose from her chair and was about to leave the room. Suddenly, her eyes fell on me. You should have seen her. Unfortunately, at that very moment she turned around, I was shaking my head sorrowfully. Not on purpose, but quite involuntary, for I had been following the whole conversation so closely. Mrs. Van Dam turned around and began to reel off a lot of harsh, German, common, and ill-mannered, just like a coarse, red-faced fishwife. It was a marvelous sight. If I could draw, I'd have liked to catch her like this. It was a scream! Such a stupid, foolish little person. Anyhow, I've learned one thing now. You only really get to know people when you've had a jolly good row with them. And then only can you judge their true characters. Yours, Anne. Tuesday, September 29th, 1942. Dear Kitty, extraordinary things can happen to people who go into hiding. Just imagine. As there is no bath, we use a wash tub, and because there is hot water in the office, by which I always mean the whole of the lower floor. All 7 of us take turns to make use of this great luxury. But because we are all so different and some are more modest than others, each member of the family has found his own place for carrying out the performance. Peter uses the kitchen in spite of its glass door. When he is going to have a bath, he goes to each one of us in turn and tells us that we must not walk past the kitchen for half an hour. He seems to think this is sufficient. Mr. Van Dam goes right upstairs. To him, it is worth the bother of carrying hot water all that way, so as to have the seclusion of his own room. Mrs. Van Dam simply doesn't bathe at all. At present. She is waiting to see which is the best place. Daddy has his bath in the private office, Mummy behind a fire guard in the kitchen. Margot and I have chosen the front office for our scrub. The curtains there are drawn. On Saturday afternoons we wash ourselves in semi-darkness. However, I don't like this place any longer, and since last week, I've been on the lookout for more comfortable quarters. Peter gave me an idea. That was to try the large office bathroom, where I can sit down, have a light on, lock the door, pour my own bathwater away, and I'm safe from prying eyes. I tried my beautiful bathroom on Sunday for the first time, and although it sounds mad, I think it's the very best place of all. Last week, the plumber was at work downstairs to move the drains and water pipes from the office bathroom to the passage. This change is a precaution against frozen pipes in case we should have a cold winter. The plumber's visit was far from pleasant for us. Not only were we unable to draw water the whole day, but we could not go to the bathroom either. Now, it's rather indecent to tell you what we did to overcome this difficulty. However, I'm not such a prude that I can't talk about these things. The day we arrived here, Daddy and I improvised with a potty for ourselves. Not having better receptacle, we sacrificed a glass preserving jar for this purpose. During the plumber's visit, nature's offerings were deposited in the jars and sitting room during the day. I don't think this was nearly as bad as having to sit still and not talk for the whole day. You can't imagine what a trial it was for Miss Quack Quack. I have to whisper in ordinary days, but not being able to speak or move was 10 times worse. After being flattened by 3 days of continuous sitting, my bottom was very stiff and painful. Some exercise at bedtime helped. Yours, Anne. Bye, guys.